When your own parents humiliate the man you love in front of hundreds of guests, something inside you shatters quietly. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just watched frozen as my father lifted his champagne glass and said, "To my daughters, brave choice. Marrying for love instead of money." The laughter that followed sliced through the air, sharper than the clink of crystal. My fiancé Daniel smiled politely, his fingers tightening around mine under the tablecloth. My mother leaned toward a group of family friends and whispered loud enough for the front row to hear, "He drives a Toyota, bless his heart." More laughter, cameras flashing, and me standing in my own wedding dress, realizing the people who raised me were about to destroy the most important day of my life. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Daniel owned a $12.3 million tech company. And before the night ended, they would find out. The reception hall shimmered with gold light chandeliers glowing above crystal vases and white roses. The Whitmore estate in Charleston had hosted senators, CEOs, even a governor once. My mother made sure everyone remembered that. To her, the wedding wasn't a celebration, it was a statement. The tables were set with monogrammed napkins, imported china, and enough champagne to float a yacht. Every detail screamed legacy. But for all the glamour, the room felt suffocating, like being wrapped in velvet that wouldn't let you breathe. Daniel stood beside me at the head table, straight-backed, calm, his blue tie slightly loosened. He'd wanted a small wedding, something intimate with laughter instead of speeches. My parents refused. "Our family has a reputation," my father said when we argued about it months earlier. "This union must reflect that." By union, he didn't mean love, he meant optics. The Whitmores didn't marry for emotion, they married for empire. As the orchestra played a waltz too slow for joy, I caught sight of my father Harold shaking hands with a local developer, his laugh-booming chest puffed like he owned the air itself. My mother Evelyn glided between tables collecting compliments like pearls. Their eyes flicked toward Daniel occasionally, each glance a silent assessment. Shoes too plain, watch not expensive enough, demeanor too modest. To them, modesty meant weakness. I heard the first whisper before dessert. "She could have married into the Benton family," someone said behind me. "And she chose him, a startup boy." The word startup carried the same weight as scandal. My spine straightened, my smile fixed. I was used to whispers, I'd grown up around them, but that night each one hit like static electricity against my skin. Daniel leaned closer. "You okay?" he asked quietly. His voice grounded me, warm and low. I nodded. "They just don't know you yet," he smiled faintly. "They don't need to." His calm unnerved me. He wasn't angry or defensive, just quietly aware. I thought maybe he was used to being underestimated. When the band paused, my father clinked his glass. The room fell silent. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice booming with performance, "tonight we celebrate love, though I must say unconventional love." A ripple of laughter ran through the crowd. My heart thudded. "Our daughter always had a generous heart," he continued, eyes flicking to Daniel. Too generous, perhaps. More laughter. My mother's hand fluttered dramatically at her pearls, the picture of mock protest. I looked at Daniel. He didn't flinch. His expression was composed, detached, as if he'd expected it. My father went on about family values, financial stability, and the importance of marrying wisely. Every word a needle. The applause afterward felt hollow, like clapping for a funeral. Then came my mother's turn. She leaned toward Mrs. Prescott, the governor's wife, and said, "At least he's polite. Politeness is all one can expect when one can't afford property." Her lips curled in a smile meant for society columns. I heard it. Daniel heard it. The nearby guests did too. Laughter rippled again, quieter this time, edged with discomfort. Something in me hardened. I wanted to stand to shout that Daniel wasn't some charity project, that he'd built something incredible, something they couldn't even comprehend. But before I could move, Daniel's hand found mine. "Let them talk," he whispered. His tone wasn't bitter, it was almost gentle. They'll see soon enough. His words calmed and terrified me all at once. What did he mean? What would they see? I searched his face for a clue, but he just lifted his glass and nodded toward my father, a gesture so controlled it almost looked like respect. My father, smug, took it as agreement. "Good man," he said loudly, slapping Daniel's shoulder, as if he'd won something. The photographer captured the moment, my father laughing, Daniel smiling politely, me staring somewhere past them both. I'd look at that picture later and realize it was the moment everything began to change. Dinner resumed, but the air had shifted. The string quartet played softly, their music floating over murmurs. Guests leaned closer, gossip spreading like perfume. My cousin Meredith whispered, "I can't believe they said that. He's been nothing but kind." I shrugged, unable to trust my voice. Across the table, Daniel excused himself, phone buzzing in his pocket. My father's eyes narrowed. "Even now, can't the man put down his gadget for one evening?" Daniel smiled as he stood. "Just work," he said lightly. "But the kind that doesn't involve begging investors for loans, I promise." My father didn't catch the barb, but I did. It was the first crack in Daniel's calm veneer, a flash of steel beneath all that composure. He disappeared toward the back hallway, phone pressed to his ear. I caught fragments of his voice, measured, confident. "Yes, they're here. No, not yet. 20 minutes should do it." He hung up and returned, expression unreadable. "Everything all right?" I asked. "Perfect," he said. "You'll see." When dessert was served, a 5-tier red velvet cake that looked more architectural than edible, the whispers turned into speculation. Does he even have a stable job? She's marrying potential, not money. Love's cute until the bills arrive. Every comment felt like a tiny fracture. I looked at Daniel again. His phone buzzed once more. He glanced at the screen, then at me. "Everything's ready," he said quietly. I frowned. For what he smiled, a small knowing curve of his lips. "You'll find out soon." Outside, through the tall glass windows, I saw faint headlights approaching the front gate, sleek black cars moving in formation. Guests began noticing too, turning their heads. "Who's arriving this late?" someone asked. My father, ever the host, gestured to a waiter. "Check who's making that commotion." I turned to Daniel, heart racing. He leaned close, whispering so only I could hear. "I think it's time your parents learned what poor really looks like." The room fell into a hush as the valet doors opened and a silver limousine rolled to a stop. A camera flash exploded outside. Then another. A murmur ran through the hall. "Is that..." Reporters. My mother's smile faltered. My father stood confused. Daniel straightened his tie and offered me his arm. "Shall we?" he asked softly. I took his arm, my pulse pounding in my ears. The doors swung wide, a burst of cold Charleston night sweeping through the warmth of the hall. Outside, under the gleam of the chandelier spilling onto marble steps, waited a group of people in suits, and behind them, 2 men holding cameras, shouting questions. "Mr. Carter, is it true your company secured the federal defense contract this morning?" one of them called out. Gasps echoed through the crowd. My father froze mid-step, his mouth opening and closing like he'd forgotten how words worked. Daniel smiled for the camera's hands still resting over mine. "Let's just say Lumitech had a good week," he said evenly. "Now, if you'll excuse us, my investors wanted to offer their congratulations in person." I turned to look at my parents. Their expressions were almost identical, disbelief painted over pride, melting fast into shame. My mother's hand trembled against her pearls. My father's champagne glass slipped slightly, a few drops hitting the carpet. And me, I finally smiled. The kind that didn't hurt behind the teeth. The kind that said the tables had just begun to turn. The morning after the wedding, I woke up to a silence so thick it felt like another body in the room. The white dress was draped over the chair by the window, wrinkled and stained with champagne. Daniel was in the kitchen making coffee, calm as always. His quiet unnerved me. It was the same calm he wore when my father humiliated him. Outside, Charleston was already buzzing the city, pretending nothing extraordinary had happened. But for me, everything had shifted. While the world would talk about the limo and the flashing cameras, I couldn't stop thinking about how we'd gotten here. How a love story that began with kindness had turned into a war between pride and peace. 2 years earlier, I'd met Daniel on a rainy afternoon in Austin. I was finishing grad school in economics, hiding from a thunderstorm in a coffee shop that smelled like old books and burnt sugar. He was sitting at the next table typing furiously, a laptop surrounded by napkins scribbled with notes. When my screen froze, I must have let out a groan because he looked up, smiled, and said, "Try restarting the Wi-Fi. Sometimes it just needs patience." I laughed, not at the advice, but at his tone, gentle, certain, and completely unbothered by the storm outside. He helped me fix the problem, and we ended up talking for 2 hours. He told me he was building a small tech company called Lumatech, still in its early days. I told him about my thesis on global markets and how numbers sometimes made more sense than people. When the rain stopped, he walked me to my car. Before I drove away, he said, "I'm not sure if this counts as fate or bad weather, but I'm glad it happened. Our dates were nothing like the ones my parents approved of. No fancy restaurants, no velvet chairs, no photos for society pages. We ate pizza in his car, hiked the Barton Creek trails, and talked about everything: failure, fear, and why neither of us believed in luck. I dated men who thought wealth was personality. Daniel was different. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, it was always something that stayed with me. Once I told my best friend Maya about him. She grinned and said, "He doesn't sound like your parents' type." I laughed. That's the point. The trouble began the moment my parents found out. My mother Evelyn asked casually over brunch, "Where did you meet him?" When I told her, she blinked. "So, he's a barista." My father Harold put down his newspaper. "No, he's probably a freelancer." Same thing, unstable. I tried to explain that Daniel ran a tech startup, that he was brilliant, disciplined, and patient, but my father waved it off. Dreamers don't pay mortgages. It wasn't the words that hurt, it was how easily he dismissed someone he didn't even know. To them, class wasn't about income. It was blood, posture, legacy. Daniel didn't belong to the Whitmore circle, and that alone made him a liability. A month later, I brought Daniel home for dinner, hoping to change their minds. The table was set like a magazine, spread silver cutlery, candles, a meal prepared by a private chef. Daniel arrived with a bottle of red wine and wildflowers he'd picked himself. My mother's smile tightened. "How thoughtful," she said. Throughout dinner, they asked him questions that sounded polite but weren't. "What does your family do, Daniel? Are your parents still working? How many employees does your company have?" He answered calmly, speaking of innovation, about creating systems that helped small businesses grow. My father chuckled. "Ah, so not real finance. Hobby finance." Daniel didn't react, but I felt the heat rise in my chest. When he excused himself to take a call, my mother leaned over and whispered, "Sweetheart, kindness doesn't pay bills. You deserve stability." I remember my fork trembling against the plate. That night after dinner, I argued with her for the first time in my life. She said marrying down means suffering later. I said maybe marrying for status means suffering forever. Her palm met my cheek before either of us realized it. It wasn't rage, it was fear. Fear of losing control, of watching me choose something she couldn't measure. I packed a bag that night and moved into a small apartment near campus. My father didn't call. My mother sent one text, "You'll regret this phase." Daniel never asked for details. He just showed up with takeout and said, "Sometimes peace costs distance." One night, sitting on the floor surrounded by cardboard boxes, he told me, "Someday I'll show them who I am. But not to prove them wrong, to prove that you chose right." I wanted to believe him. He slid a simple silver ring onto my finger. When I teased no gold, he smiled. Because real value isn't what shines under chandeliers. I didn't know then how literal that line would become. Months passed. His company grew quietly, one client at a time. I saw the long nights, the code running across multiple screens, the notebooks filled with ideas. He never bragged. He never rushed. Meanwhile, my parents continued to send invitations. I ignored birthdays, charity galas, silent reminders that I was still the disobedient daughter. When Daniel proposed officially, we decided on a small engagement dinner. None of my family came. Instead, my mother sent an email. "We hope you come to your senses before the wedding." I showed it to Daniel, expecting him to be angry. He just read it once, smiled faintly, and deleted it. "Let them talk," he said. The same words he would whisper again years later under the golden lights of our wedding reception. But back then I didn't see what was forming beneath that calm exterior. While my parents dismissed him as ordinary, Daniel was building something extraordinary. He spent nights on conference calls with investors in New York, days testing new software prototypes. Once I woke up at 3 in the morning and found him sitting by the window, laptop open, city lights reflected in his eyes. I asked what he was doing. He said, "Writing the code that will change everything." I didn't ask what he meant. Maybe I was afraid to believe in something that big. I'd spent too long being told that dreams were dangerous. Still, something about his certainty made me want to protect it. One evening, while walking along the river, Daniel said quietly, "You know they'll never see me coming. People like your parents only notice noise, not progress." I stopped, looked at him. "And when they finally do," he smiled, the kind of smile that hid 1,000 unspoken plans. "Then they'll have to decide whether to apologize or deny." A week before the wedding, my father called for the first time in months. "If you insist on marrying him," he said, "we'll host it ourselves. At least it'll look respectable." His voice was steady, calculated. I agreed, not because I wanted his approval, but because I wanted to end the charade on my terms. When I hung up, Daniel was watching me from the doorway. "Are you sure?" he asked. I nodded. "Let them control the stage," I said. "We'll control the story." That night he held me and said, "You're stronger than you think." I told him I learned from the best, but in truth I was terrified. My parents had built their world on power and pride. Daniel had built his on patience and silence, and I was the bridge between them, fragile, trembling, but still standing. As I stared at the wrinkled wedding dress in the morning light, I realized something. The humiliation that shattered me last night wasn't new. It was the final verse of a song that had been playing my entire life. The laughter, the judgment, the way love always had to be earned. Daniel set a cup of coffee beside me and said softly, "You're quiet." "I'm remembering," I said. He nodded. "Good. Remembering means you're still writing." When he turned away, I looked down at the silver ring on my finger, its surface scratched from years of wear. It didn't gleam like gold, but it caught the light in its own quiet way. And for the first time, I understood what he meant that night, on the floor of our old apartment. Real value isn't what shines under chandeliers. It's what survives after the lights go out. The invitation arrived on a Sunday morning. My mother's text was short and sweet: "Lunch at home. We need to talk about your future." I almost believed it was genuine. I almost thought they'd finally accepted Daniel, that maybe the silence since the engagement had softened into something like grace. I was wrong. That afternoon, when Daniel and I pulled up to the Whitmore estate, the house looked exactly as it always had: immaculate, intimidating, and utterly cold. My mother opened the door wearing pearls, and that signature smile that meant trouble. "Evelyn, darling," she said, kissing my cheek, "you look pale. City life not treating you well." Her eyes slid to Daniel. "And you brought flowers. How lovely." She took the bouquet like it was a formality, something to set aside, rather than admire. Inside, the dining room gleamed. The table was set with 12 chairs, though there were only 6 of us: my parents, 2 relatives, their pastor, and us. I caught Daniel's uneasy glance and whispered, "It'll be fine." But the air already smelled like judgment. We sat, the china clinking softly as plates were served. My father cleared his throat and started talking about the importance of building a stable foundation. My uncle nodded like a well-trained echo. The pastor smiled politely. It was the kind of conversation where every sentence was a test and every smile carried a warning. "So Daniel, my mother began, tell us again what you do exactly." He smiled unruffled. "I'm in tech. My company builds data management systems for small businesses." "Ah," my uncle said, "computers. My grandson plays with those too." The table laughed, except Daniel. He just took a sip of water. My father leaned forward. "A startup then? Risky business?" "Every business is risky at first," Daniel replied. "Even construction once was." My father's jaw tightened. "Construction builds something you can touch." Daniel smiled lightly. "So does progress. You just need a different kind of blueprint." The silence that followed was sharp enough to draw blood. My mother broke it with a laugh that was too high too quick. "Such ambition. It's admirable really to be so confident without guarantees." Under the table I felt Daniel's hand on mine. He squeezed once steady calm. I wished I could borrow his composure. After dessert my father asked me to step into his office. The last time I'd been in that room, I was 16 begging to study art instead of economics. He'd stood in the same spot next to the wall of framed awards and handshakes with men in suits. Now he was there again, holding a folder in his hand. "I know you think this marriage is about love," he said, "but marriage is also about protecting what's been built." He opened the folder. "This is a prenuptial agreement. It ensures our assets stay within the family." I stared at the papers. "You mean your assets?" He smiled thinly. "One day they'll be yours, or rather they would have been." My pulse thudded in my ears. "You don't need to protect me, Dad. You just don't want him to belong." He sighed. "We built this family name. I won't let a man with nothing inherit it." That word inherit hit me harder than I expected. He didn't mean money. He meant legacy, reputation, the invisible chains he wore like armor. When I walked out, Daniel was waiting in the hallway. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't have to. My silence told him everything. "He doesn't scare me," Daniel said quietly. "He scares me," I whispered, "because I see myself becoming him if I keep choosing silence." Before dinner resumed, I splashed water on my face in the downstairs bathroom, trying to swallow the lump in my throat. My reflection looked unfamiliar, half defiant, half exhausted. When I returned, the air had changed. The table was reset for dessert, but the tension was thicker. My mother stood raising her glass. "A toast," she announced, "to family and to understanding that love sometimes needs guidance." Her eyes met mine over the rim of her glass. Different worlds don't always mix, but with patience maybe they can coexist. Daniel set his fork down. "Different worlds mix all the time," he said softly. "It's how we evolve." My uncle snorted, spoken like someone who's never had something worth protecting. Daniel's expression didn't change. "You might be surprised." My father's voice cut through the room. "Watch your tone, son." Daniel met his gaze evenly. I wasn't aware honesty had a tone. For a second, no one breathed. Then my mother forced a laugh, shaky this time. "Ah, young passion. So refreshing," she looked at me. "You'll learn to tame it, dear." I pushed back my chair and stood. "No, I won't." My father frowned. "Sit down, Evelyn." "No," I said again. If this is what family means, mocking someone because he didn't inherit privilege, then maybe I don't want to belong. My mother's eyes widened. "Don't be dramatic." "Dramatic." My voice rose. "You humiliate him in your own home, and I'm the one being dramatic." The room froze. Even the pastor looked away. My father's face hardened. "You walk out that door, don't expect to walk back in." Daniel stood too. "Then we'll save you the trouble." He reached for my hand. My mother's voice trembled. "You'll regret this." I turned at the door. "Maybe. But at least it'll be my regret, not yours." Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the marble steps. The air smelled of roses and rain, but it couldn't wash away the sting of that dinner. Daniel didn't speak as we got into the car. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of everything we couldn't say. Halfway down the driveway, he finally asked, You sure you want to go through with this wedding? I stared out the window at the house shrinking behind us. I've never been more sure of anything, he smiled faintly. Then we build our own kind of family. That sentence stayed with me long after the house disappeared in the rearview mirror. That night my phone buzzed. A new email from my father. Since you insist on ruining your future, we'll host the wedding ourselves. At least we can make it respectable. I showed it to Daniel. He read it once, then set the phone down. They want control, he said. Let them think they have it. I laughed softly, though my chest ached. They think respect is something you can decorate a table with. Daniel took my hand. Then let's teach them what it really looks like. We drove in silence for a while, the road stretching endlessly ahead. The city lights faded behind us, replaced by open fields and the promise of distance. As the first stars appeared, I looked at Daniel and whispered, "They said you're not our kind." He glanced at me, a smile ghosting across his lips. "They're right," he said. "I'm better." I laughed through my tears. That night, lying beside him, I couldn't sleep. I thought of my father's office, the papers on the desk, the weight of his words. I thought of my mother's trembling glass, her need to make everything look perfect even as it shattered. I realized then that the inheritance I'd been raised to protect was never mine to begin with. It belonged to their fear of losing control, of being ordinary, of loving without conditions. Daniel stirred beside me, half asleep, and murmured, "You okay?" I turned toward him, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "I will be." Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, soft and low, like a warning and a promise all at once. I closed my eyes and whispered, "They said you weren't our kind, but maybe that's exactly why I chose you." The night after that disastrous lunch, I followed Daniel up the stairs to his apartment, still half expecting him to be angry. He wasn't. The door opened to a room full of light and hum-soft music, computers glowing on every surface, stacks of notebooks, and walls covered in diagrams drawn with blue marker. To anyone else, it might have looked chaotic. To me, it felt alive. He dropped his keys on the counter, poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs, and said, "You can sit anywhere if you can find a spot." I laughed weakly and sat on the edge of the couch, surrounded by a tangle of wires and screens. "This is where you work." "This is where I build," he corrected. I looked around again. "You've been hiding a whole world from me." He smiled. "Not hiding, just waiting until it made sense to show it." He set down my cup, then walked to the large whiteboard on the wall. I'd seen glimpses of his notes before, bits of code, messy flowcharts, but never the full picture. At the top in neat letters was one word: Lumitech. I pointed at it. "That's your company." He nodded. "Started it when I was 23. Everyone thought it would fail. I was broke, living in a garage. My friends called it lunatic tech for months." He laughed softly, then added, "Maybe they were half right." I walked closer, tracing one of the lines on the board with my eyes. "What is it?" "An intelligent data system for businesses. Something that learns how people work instead of forcing them to adapt to machines. We've been testing it with a few big clients. If it keeps performing the way it's been." He stopped, shrugged. "It could change things." I stared at him. "You mean it already is changing things?" He didn't answer, just smiled, like someone who'd learned patience the hard way. "I've been so afraid," I admitted. "Every time my father looks at you, I feel like I'm standing on trial." He leaned against the desk, arms crossed, studying me. "He looks through me, not at me. That's different." "That doesn't make it better," I said. "No," he agreed, "but it makes it easier to ignore." I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the image of my father's smirk. "They think you're just playing." His voice softened. "Let them think that." I frowned. "Doesn't it bother you? Not anymore?" He turned back to the board. "When you spend enough years being laughed at, you learn something valuable. Noise fades, but results last." I watched him then, the way he spoke, steady and grounded, like someone who'd been broken before and rebuilt without fanfare. He looked over his shoulder. "You want to see what I've been working on?" He walked to the computer, typed a few lines, and the screen came alive with colors and charts. It's tracking company behavior, predicting decisions before they happen. We just signed our third pilot contract. I blinked. You signed? You're running all of this alone, not alone. There's a small team, but they don't even know it's me. Lumitech operates under a holding name. Keeps us under the radar. My breath caught. You're serious, he smiled. Quiet growth lasts longer, Evelyn. The way he said my name made my chest tighten. Why didn't you tell me? Because I wanted you to love me before you loved what I built. That silenced me. For a long moment, all I could hear was the hum of the computer and my own heartbeat. Finally, I whispered, "They don't deserve to see this." He turned, meeting my eyes. "No, but one day they'll have to." I shook my head. "They'll never understand." "They don't have to understand," he said. "They just need to see." We sat on the couch after that, coffee cooling between us. I told him how small I'd felt at that dinner, how every laugh had landed like a bruise. He listened without interrupting, his thumb tracing circles over my knuckles. "You've spent your whole life trying to earn their approval," he said, "but the only thing you ever needed was permission to be yourself." "And you?" I asked. "What do you need?" He smiled faintly. "Peace. That's what I've been building all along." I thought about that for a while. Then quietly I asked, "Why didn't you fight back today?" "Because if I fight them, I become them," he said. "If I stay silent, I stay free." His calm unsettled me. I was raised to believe silence was weakness. But the way he wore it like armor made it feel powerful. He stood and walked to the window. The city stretched below us, all light and motion. "You can't argue pride out of people," he said. "You just outgrow it." The rain started then, tapping softly on the glass. He turned back to me, his voice low. "You don't need to defend me, Evelyn. Just stand beside me. That's enough." It was such a simple thing to ask, but it carried the weight of everything we'd been through. Later, when the rain slowed, I told him about my childhood, the endless piano recitals, the way my father would shake his head if I missed a note. How my mother's compliments always came with conditions. "Perfection was love," I said. "If you were flawless, you were safe." Daniel listened quietly, eyes steady. "Then let's build something imperfect," he said. "Something real." I didn't realize I was crying until he brushed away a tear with his thumb. "Do you ever wish you could make them see it?" I asked. He smiled, that quiet, knowing smile again. "I already am, they just don't know it yet." When I stood to leave, I noticed an email draft open on his computer screen. The subject line read, "Investor Press Event, Lumitech." I glanced at him. "You're launching something." "Not yet," he said. "But soon. Timing is everything." "What kind of timing?" He hesitated, then said, "You'll know when it happens." I didn't press. Some part of me trusted that whatever he was planning, it wasn't revenge, it was revelation. He walked me to the door, then stopped. "Wait," he said. "One more thing." He went to the desk and picked up the silver ring I'd worn since the night he proposed. "I made a change," he said. Inside the band, faintly etched, were the words, "Value isn't visible." "It's the truth," he said softly. "Everything that lasts is invisible first." I looked up at him. Like faith. Exactly. When he slid the ring back onto my finger, I felt something inside me settle. I spent the night on his couch, listening to the soft tapping of rain against the window. He fell asleep at his desk, the glow of the screen lighting his face. The keyboard clicked every so often, the steady rhythm of someone shaping the future one keystroke at a time. Before I drifted off, I whispered, "You don't need to prove anything to them." From across the room, his voice floated back, half asleep but certain. "I'm not proving, I'm building." I woke up at dawn to the sound of birds outside, and Daniel still at his computer, eyes heavy but bright. He turned to me, smiled, and said, "Go back to sleep. It's going to be a long year." I didn't know what he meant, not yet. But as I watched him type, the sun rising behind him, I realized his silence wasn't emptiness. It was power waiting for its moment. And when that moment came, I knew it would change everything. They said a wedding was supposed to feel like a dream. Mine felt like a countdown. Every tick of the clock on the wall sounded heavier than the last each minute, dragging me closer to a day that no longer felt like a celebration. The silk of my wedding gown clung to my skin as if it could sense my hesitation. I stood in front of the mirror staring at a woman I barely recognized. Perfect hair, flawless makeup, and eyes that no longer looked like mine. Daniel knocked softly before stepping in. He was carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers, the kind that grew along the Texas highway where we used to walk on weekends. "They're not fancy," he said, handing them to me. "But they're real." I smiled faintly. "That's more than I can say for the rest of today." He placed the flowers on the vanity and looked at me through the mirror. "You're beautiful," he said quietly. "I look like someone else." He came closer, resting his hands on my shoulders. "You look like the woman I fell in love with, just braver." "Brave," I repeated, letting out a shaky breath. "That's one word for it." The rehearsal dinner was scheduled for that evening, and my parents had spared no expense. The Whitmore estate was being transformed into a cathedral of wealth, gold drapes, imported flowers, and a dining table that stretched the entire length of the garden. I'd walked through earlier watching caterers bustle under the direction of my mother, who moved like a general before a battle. When Daniel and I arrived, my father was already shaking hands with guests, each one an investor, business partner, or politician. My mother greeted me with her usual too-perfect smile. "Evelyn, sweetheart," she said, adjusting my hair without asking. "Let's make tonight easy for everyone. No surprises, no speeches, and definitely no awkwardness." "Awkwardness?" I asked. "You mean honesty?" Her smile faltered for half a second. "Don't be unkind. Appearances matter. Only to people afraid of reality," I murmured. She sighed, lowering her voice. "Darling, you can live in love or you can live in comfort. You can't have both." "I'd rather be uncomfortable and real," I said. She looked at me the way someone looks at a child who still believes in magic. "You'll learn," she whispered. The rehearsal dinner began under the glow of 1,000 tiny lights strung across the garden. Laughter rose like perfume, and the air smelled of money and expensive wine. Daniel sat beside me, calm and composed, though I could feel the tension in his shoulders. He wore his one good suit, the same one he'd worn when we signed our apartment lease. It wasn't designer, but it fit him perfectly, simple, sharp, honest. "Evelyn," one of my father's associates called from across the table, "how does it feel marrying a tech genius?" My father laughed too loudly. "Genius. Let's not exaggerate. Daniel's a smart man, but he's still learning what real business looks like." Laughter rippled around the table. Daniel didn't flinch. He smiled politely, cutting his steak with surgical precision. I set down my fork. "Dad," I said quietly, "that was unnecessary." "It was a joke," he replied without looking at me. "It wasn't funny." "Neither is poverty," he said, taking a sip of wine. The words hit me harder than I expected. My mother shot me a warning look from across the table, the one that meant, "Don't make a scene." I swallowed hard, forcing a smile. Daniel's hand brushed against mine, under the table, grounding me. "It's okay," he murmured. But it wasn't. As dinner ended, I slipped away to the far end of the garden, needing air. The fairy lights shimmered above, and the smell of roses hung heavy. I heard footsteps behind me. My mother's voice followed. "You shouldn't walk off like that. People notice." I turned. "Good. Maybe they'll notice how you treat us," she sighed. "Don't twist this, Evelyn. We love you. We just want what's best for you." "What's best for me, or what's best for you?" Her silence was answer enough. "You think I'm throwing away everything you've built," I said. She looked at me, eyes glistening. "I think you're marrying a man who will never understand what you gave up." "I didn't give anything up," I said. I escaped it. Her face hardened. "One day you'll understand. The world isn't kind to dreamers." I smiled sadly. "Then I guess I'll learn the hard way." Later that night, after the guests had left, I found Daniel standing alone by the pond behind the house. The reflection of the lights shimmered across the water. He didn't turn when I approached. "They'll never accept me," he said softly. "I don't need them to." He turned, then eyes searching mine. "Do you trust me with everything I said? Then no matter what happens tomorrow, remember that." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "If something goes wrong, open this." I frowned. "What is it?" He smiled, the kind of smile that carried secrets. "A promise. For after." I wanted to ask more, but he pressed a finger to his lips. "You'll know when it's time." The wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of thunder from somewhere far off. I shivered. He draped his jacket over my shoulders. "I hate that they treat you like this," I whispered. He looked out toward the horizon. "People fear what reminds them of what they're missing." "What are they missing?" "Integrity," he said. I leaned into him. For a moment, the world felt small enough to survive. When I finally returned inside, the house was nearly empty. My father sat alone in the study, drink in hand, the glow of a single lamp painting deep lines across his face. "You still have time to change your mind," he said without looking up. I stood in the doorway. "You still have time to believe I know what I'm doing." He laughed softly. "You're marrying a man who brings nothing to this family. Maybe I'm marrying the only man who doesn't see me as an asset." He took a long drink, eyes cold. "You'll regret this. When he leaves, when it falls apart, you'll realize stability was worth more than love." I stepped closer, my voice steady. "Maybe. Or maybe love is the only wealth that lasts." For the first time, he looked at me. There was something almost fragile in his gaze, a flicker of recognition, like he saw the same fire in me that once lived in him. Then he looked away. "Go to bed," he said. "Big day tomorrow." As I walked upstairs, I saw a letter sitting half hidden under a pile of papers on his desk. Curiosity won. I picked it up. "To my daughter, should this marriage fail." I stopped reading after that line. I folded the letter back, placed it exactly where I found it, and walked away. In my room, I tore the veil off the mannequin and held it in my hands. The fabric shimmered under the light, fragile, transparent, just like the illusion of control my parents clung to. Tomorrow I would walk down an aisle they built, but the choice finally would be mine. Outside, rain began to fall in slow, steady drops, drumming against the window like a heartbeat. I closed my eyes, breathing in the storm. I whispered to myself, tomorrow I stop inheriting their fear. And in the distance, thunder rolled, soft warning and full of promise. The morning of the wedding felt colder than December had any right to be. Frost clung to the trees outside the Whitmore estate, and every breath I took fogged the air like smoke. Inside the mansion was chaos, wrapped in luxury, florists rushing through hallways, camera crews adjusting lights, and my mother directing it all, as if the world might stop spinning if one ribbon wasn't symmetrical. I stood by the window in my bridal suite, still wearing the white robe embroidered with my initials, watching the driveway fill with cars I didn't recognize. The guest list had tripled overnight once my parents decided that the wedding was their social resurrection. They'd lost influence after my father's business setback, but today was their chance to prove the Whitmore name still meant something. Except this wedding wasn't really theirs, it was mine. And yet, as I looked around the room, a sea of white roses, champagne silk, and perfection that didn't feel like me, I couldn't find a single trace of my own choice. Daniel had texted me earlier. "Almost there. Don't let them ruin today." I typed back, "They already started trying." He sent a heart emoji, which made me laugh through my nerves. That was him. Steady, simple, unshaken. He didn't care about their judgment, but I did. Maybe because deep down I still wanted my family to see him the way I did, not as an outsider but as the man who'd stood by me when no one else would. A knock came at the door. My mother entered, wrapped in silver satin, her expression sharp enough to slice through glass. "You're not dressed," she said, her voice tight. "I needed a minute," I replied. She looked around the room, adjusting a vase that didn't need adjusting. "There are no minutes today, Evelyn. Everything must be perfect." Whose definition of perfect? Her eyes flashed. "Don't start. Your father's in a mood already. The guests are arriving and Daniel, well, you know how he makes people talk." I turned. "People like who?" "People who understand what it means to marry into legacy," she said, her tone soft but laced with poison. I took a breath. "He built his own legacy. You just don't recognize it because it doesn't come with marble floors," she frowned. You're being ungrateful. Do you know how much effort we put into this? How much this family needs to recover its image? I thought this was a wedding, not a press conference. Her eyes softened slightly, pity replacing irritation. You'll understand one day, stability isn't built on love, it's built on alignment. I smiled faintly. Then maybe I chose the wrong blueprint. She left without another word. By the time I slipped into my dress, the first guests had already arrived. Through the window, I could see photographers waiting by the iron gates, their cameras glinting like hungry eyes. My stomach twisted. When Daniel's car pulled up a modest black sedan, not a limo, I heard the collective hum of judgment ripple through the crowd. My father stood at the top of the steps, shaking hands, his smile wide but brittle. He didn't greet Daniel right away. Instead, he turned to one of his associates and said, just loud enough for others to hear, "I hope she knows what she's marrying into." The laughter that followed was quiet, cruel, familiar. I walked down the stairs slowly, every click of my heels echoing through the marble foyer. Daniel saw me and smiled, that calm, grounding smile that always disarmed me. For a moment the noise faded. It was just us again. "You look beautiful," he whispered when I reached him. "Thank you for coming back," I said, half joking, half serious. "I promised you forever," he said. "I'm not breaking that over bad manners." When the ceremony began, everything looked picture perfect. The flowers, the light, the crowd pretending to care. But the air was heavy. My father's expression never softened. My mother's eyes darted toward the guests like she was waiting for applause. The vows went smoothly until it was Daniel's turn. He took my hand, voice steady, eyes warm. "Evelyn," he said, "I didn't come into your life to fix it. I came to remind you that it was never broken." Someone in the audience whispered, poetic, followed by a chuckle. I didn't need to turn to know who it was. My cousin Leah, the echo of my parents' arrogance. Daniel ignored it. He slipped the ring onto my finger, and when he said "I do," he looked at me like no one else existed. But the peace didn't last long. At the reception, champagne flowed like water, and so did the commentary. I caught bits of it everywhere I turned. Self-made, apparently. Doesn't even own property. Maybe she's just in love with potential. Every word stung like a spark. I found Daniel near the garden terrace, talking to a group of my father's colleagues. They wore the same polite smirks, the same measuring eyes. One of them said, "So, Daniel, what do you do exactly?" "Consulting, freelance tech." Daniel smiled easily. "You could say that. I'm in technology investments." The man laughed. "Ah, investments. So, still climbing, huh?" My father appeared beside them, his tone dripping with false cheer. "We're all climbing, son. Some just haven't found the right ladder yet." The group laughed. Daniel didn't. He just looked at me across the terrace and said quietly, "It's fine." But it wasn't. Not for me. When we finally sat for dinner, the conversation turned into a stage. My father, half drunk on praise and power, raised his glass. "To my daughter who's always had a good heart," he began. "And to Daniel, may he find success in something more stable than dreams." The laughter that followed was loud, sharp, and unforgettable. My mother smiled nervously, as if pretending it was just a joke could undo the damage. Daniel set down his fork. "Thank you, sir," he said evenly. "I'll drink to that." He raised his glass, his tone calm but with an edge that made even my father blink. Because stability doesn't come from what you own, it comes from who you are when you have nothing left to prove. The table fell silent. My father's smile froze. And then, as if the universe had been waiting for this cue, the sound of engines filled the driveway. Every head turned toward the massive windows overlooking the estate entrance. A sleek black limo rolled in, followed by 2 SUVs, the crowd murmured. The car doors opened, and out stepped 3 men in tailored suits, tech investors. The kind of faces even my father recognized from magazines. Cameras flashed. Daniel turned to me, whispering, "You'll want to see this." Within seconds, the whispers began. "Is that... Wait, those are the Harrington Group partners. Why are they here?" One of the men walked straight toward Daniel, grinning. "Sorry, we're late, boss. Traffic was brutal." The room went dead quiet. My father's hand froze around his wine glass. Daniel nodded. "Glad you could make it." He turned back to my father, his voice calm but cutting. "I was going to tell you about the acquisition next week, but I suppose tonight works just as well." My father blinked. "Acquisition?" Daniel smiled faintly. "Lumatech. We closed at 12.3 million. Officially." The silence shattered into chaos, flashes, gasps, and disbelief swirling like confetti. My father's face drained of color. My mother's eyes darted between us, wide and trembling. Daniel took my hand. "Now, if you'll excuse us," he said, his tone polite but final, "my investors would like a word with the press." We walked through the stunned crowd, hand in hand, the sound of murmurs rising behind us like waves. Outside, the cold air hit my skin, sharp and cleansing. He looked at me and smiled, the same quiet smile from that first night we met. "You okay?" I exhaled. "I think I've never been better." Behind us, through the tall glass doors, I saw my father still standing motionless, silent, staring at the man he'd once called unworthy. The tables had turned, and for the first time, I didn't need to say a word. The wedding video went viral before we even left for the honeymoon. Not because of the vows or the flowers or the music, but because of the moment my father's face fell when Daniel's investors walked into the ballroom. Someone had filmed it from the corner of the room, capturing every gasp, every frozen smile, every second of humiliation. The clip spread online like wildfire. Rich parents' mock groom instantly regret it. At first, I didn't want to look, but curiosity won. Watching the replay, I felt the same chill I'd felt that night, except now the laughter wasn't on us. It was on them. For days, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Messages poured in from strangers, friends, reporters, all wanting a quote, a reaction, a headline. "Bride's revenge goes viral. Justice served at the altar." It was surreal. Daniel handled it differently. He turned off his notifications and went back to work like nothing had happened. "Let them talk," he said. "The truth doesn't need an explanation." But my parents didn't see it that way. By the time we returned to the city, my mother had called 3 times, each message more panicked than the last. "You've ruined us," she said in one voicemail, her voice trembling. "Do you understand what you've done?" Daniel deleted the messages before I could listen to the rest. "They're just reacting," he said. "Give it time." Time didn't help. The headlines kept coming, and with them the quiet collapse of the Whitmore reputation. My father's associates began pulling out of projects. Invitations stopped arriving. The family that once controlled rooms with a glance now couldn't even control the narrative. I should have felt triumphant. But instead, I felt empty. One evening, Daniel found me sitting on the balcony, staring out at the skyline. "You're thinking too much again," he said softly. "I thought this would feel better," I admitted, seeing them humbled. Watching the world finally notice how cruel they were. He sat beside me. "Does it?" I shook my head. "No. It just feels sad. Like watching something rot in slow motion." He put his arm around me. "Revenge always tastes bitter when it cools." The next morning, a black car appeared outside our building. When I looked down from the window, I saw my mother stepping out wrapped in a dark coat, her face pale. "She's here," I whispered. Daniel glanced up from his laptop. "Do you want me to stay?" "Yes," I said after a moment. "No, I need to do this alone." I met her in the lobby. She didn't hug me. Didn't smile. Just said, "We need to talk." In the cafe across the street, she sat stiffly, her hands wrapped around her cup like she was holding on to composure itself. "You've embarrassed us beyond repair," she began. "I didn't humiliate anyone," I said evenly. "You did that yourselves." Her eyes flashed. "You think this is funny? The Whitmore name has been dragged through the mud. Your father hasn't left the house since that video went viral. Maybe he's just seeing himself clearly for the first time." She flinched. "You're cruel." "No," I said. "I just stopped apologizing for being honest." She leaned in, voice trembling. He's your father. Whatever he said, whatever he did, he's still family. So am I said. You just forgot that. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Outside, snow began to fall, tiny white specks blurring the streetlights. Finally, she sighed. He wants to see you. Why, to apologize, I think. Or maybe to convince himself he still can. I hesitated. I'll think about it. When she left, I sat in the cafe alone, watching the steam rise from my untouched coffee. My reflection in the window looked unfamiliar, stronger, colder, older. That night, Daniel came home late from the office, shoulders dusted with snow. How'd it go? He asked. She wants me to talk to him. He nodded slowly. Will you? I don't know, I said. Part of me wants to let him sit in the mess he made, but another part still wants him to understand. Yes. Daniel set down his coat and cupped my face gently. You don't owe him forgiveness, Evelyn, but you deserve peace. I leaned into his touch, closing my eyes. How do I find it? He smiled faintly. By choosing not to fight ghosts. The next day, I drove to the Whitmore estate. The mansion looked smaller than I remembered. The iron gates, once symbols of pride, now seemed like prison bars. My father's car was still parked in the driveway, coated with frost. My mother met me at the door. Her eyes were red, but her voice was steady. He's in his study. The study smelled of old books and defeat. My father sat behind his desk, shoulders slumped, staring at the empty fireplace. He looked up when I entered. For the first time in my life, he didn't look powerful. He looked tired. Evelyn, he said quietly. Dad. He gestured toward the chair across from him. You came. I did. Silence stretched between us like a tightrope. Finally, he said, I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know I see now how wrong I was. I said nothing. He ran a hand over his face. I wanted control. I called it love. I told myself I was protecting you, but really I was protecting my ego. You destroyed more than your ego, I said. You destroyed trust. I know, he said softly. And I'll spend the rest of my life wishing I hadn't. I studied him for a long time. Do you regret what you said to Daniel? He exhaled. Every word. Then tell him that. I can't, he said, his voice cracking. He wouldn't want to hear it. You'd be surprised, I said. He forgives faster than you think. He looked at me then, eyes glistening. You always did choose men better than I deserved. The line caught me off guard. For a moment I saw the father I'd once adored buried under years of arrogance and fear. I don't hate you, I said quietly. But I can't be your redemption either. He nodded slowly. Then maybe I'll start by being my own. I stood to leave. As I reached the door, he said, Evelyn, I turned. I'm proud of you, he said. Even if I never said it before. The words landed softly like snow. I didn't reply. I just nodded and walked out. Outside, the air was sharp and cold, but my chest felt lighter. For the first time, I wasn't walking away in anger. I was walking toward peace. When I got home, Daniel was waiting with dinner half cooked and wine already open. You went, he said. I did, and I think he finally saw me, I said. Not as a disappointment, just as me. Daniel smiled. That's progress. We sat down at the table, steam rising from the pasta, laughter softening the silence between us. For the first time in years, dinner didn't feel like a battle. Later that night, as I watched the city lights blink through the window, I realized something. Revenge hadn't freed me. It had only cleared the space for forgiveness to take root. I whispered it to the quiet room, half to myself, half to the ghosts I was finally ready to let go of. The tables turned, I said softly, but maybe they were never meant to stay flipped. Maybe they were meant to balance. And for the first time, that felt like enough. The world woke up talking about us. Every headline, every news alert, every whispered conversation seemed to begin with our names. The Whitmore wedding scandal. The groom they called poor. The $12.3 million surprise. Even the morning air felt different, charged with the electricity of humiliation turned spectacle. I sat on the edge of the bed, phone buzzing endlessly beside me. Daniel was at the window, coffee in hand, calm as if the chaos outside belonged to another world. "They'll move on soon," he said without turning around. "People always do." "Not my parents," I whispered. "They'll never move on from being wrong." He looked over his shoulder and smiled faintly. "Then it's about time they learn how." When I finally opened my phone, the notifications blurred together. Friends, strangers, reporters, colleagues. Videos of my father's toast, his laughter, his arrogance were everywhere. The internet had turned his mockery into a meme. One clip had been shared over 2 million times, my father's words followed by Daniel's limo arriving. The cameras flashing the silence after realization hit the crowd. "They're calling you the tech billionaire groom," I said quietly. "And him, the father who laughed too soon." Daniel only shrugged. "The truth doesn't need me to defend it." But I could feel my stomach twist. For so long I'd begged for justice, for them to see Daniel as more than an inconvenience. Now that justice had come, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like exposure. By mid-morning, my mother called. I let it ring. Then she texted, "Please come home. It's bad. Your father hasn't left his office." I stared at the screen until Daniel spoke. "You should go." "I can't," I said. "He'll just twist everything again. He always does." He crossed the room, kneeling beside me. "You don't go for him. You go for you. Closure isn't about forgiveness, it's about finishing the sentence." So I went. The Whitmore house looked smaller than I remembered. The gate creaked, the driveway empty. No staff, no noise, just the faint hum of rain beginning to fall. My mother opened the door. She looked undone. Her perfect hair was loose, her face pale. "He's in his office," she said, voice trembling. "He won't eat. He won't speak to anyone but you." The hallway smelled like old wood and whiskey. When I reached the door, I hesitated, then knocked. "Come in." He was sitting at his desk, still in yesterday's suit. Papers were scattered everywhere, the television muted, but flashing headlines he couldn't escape. He didn't look up when I entered. "You came," he said finally. His voice was rough, stripped of its usual authority. "I did." He exhaled a slow, tired sound. "You must be proud." "I'm not," I said. "I didn't do this." He laughed bitterly. "You didn't stop it either." "I didn't have to. The truth stopped it for me." He looked up then, and for the first time he seemed smaller. "You humiliated me in front of everyone." "No," I said evenly. "You did that when you laughed at the man I love. The world just caught you in the act." He leaned back, shaking his head. "You sound just like him. Maybe that's why he's the first man who's ever made me feel seen." Something in his expression faltered. He looked down at his hands, old and shaking. 30 years, he said quietly. 30 years building this company, this family, this name. And now it's all ashes. "Maybe that's what happens when you build your house on pride," I said. He didn't respond. The rain outside grew heavier, drumming against the glass. After a long silence, I asked, "Do you even understand what you did?" He rubbed his face with both hands. "I was trying to protect you." "No," I said softly. "You were trying to protect yourself. From being wrong, from being less, from seeing me as someone you couldn't control." He looked at me, and for once there was no anger in his eyes, just exhaustion. Downstairs, I heard my mother moving through the house, her heels clicking nervously across the marble. Then she appeared in the doorway, voice trembling. "He hasn't slept, Evelyn. He's not himself." I turned toward her. "Maybe now he'll understand what it feels like to be dismissed." She flinched. "Please don't say that. You've made your point." I met her eyes. I never wanted to make a point. I wanted to be treated like a person. My father pressed his palms against the desk. "The company is collapsing. Investors are calling for my resignation. Maybe it's time," I said. "Maybe it's time to stop pretending you built an empire on integrity when you built it on image." He looked up sharply. For a moment I saw the old fire return, the man who could command a room with one glare. But then it faded. He slumped back, defeated. "I never hated him," he said suddenly. "Daniel, I just couldn't understand him. Men like me don't know how to value quiet strength. We only know how to fear it. I blinked, taken aback. Then fear was your legacy, not wealth. He gave a small, broken laugh. And you inherited it. I wanted to deny it, but the truth sat heavy in my chest. He wasn't wrong. I came here to end it, I said. To stop carrying what isn't mine. He nodded slowly. Then take what's left. What's left? He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small envelope. The deed to the lake house. It was supposed to be your wedding gift. I stared at it. I don't want your property, Dad. It's not for you to live in, he said quietly. It's for you to sell. Use it to build whatever future you want. Just don't repeat mine. Something inside me softened. For the first time, his voice didn't sound like command. It sounded like surrender. When I turned to leave, my mother caught my arm. He's lost everything, she whispered. I looked at her. Really looked at her. The lines around her mouth, the way she twisted her wedding ring when she was scared. Maybe losing everything is the only way to find anything. She nodded, tears finally breaking free. I just wanted you to be happy. Then stop confusing happiness with perfection, I said. Daniel was waiting in the car when I stepped outside. The rain had turned to a drizzle, soft and cold. He rolled down the window. You okay? I don't know, I said honestly. I think we both lost something today. He reached out his hand and I took it. Sometimes losing is the only way to make space for peace, he said. I looked back at the house one last time. Through the rain-streaked window, I could see my father sitting motionless, my mother standing beside him. The empire they'd built looked smaller now, almost human. As we drove away, I whispered, for years they taught me to fear losing face. But maybe you have to lose your face to find your soul. Daniel didn't speak. He just drove, one hand on the wheel, the other still holding mine. The city lights blurred past us, gold against gray. By the time we reached home, the storm had stopped. The world outside was quiet again, washed clean. I stood at the window watching droplets slide down the glass. Behind me, Daniel poured wine, his voice gentle. To endings, he said. I turned, smiling faintly. To beginnings, I replied. The glasses clinked softly, a sound so small, yet so complete. And for the first time in my life, silence felt like peace, not punishment. The apartment was too quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet that came after a storm, but the kind that echoed. Daniel was at the table, laptop open, the soft hum of the city filtering through the windows. I sat on the couch watching steam rise from my untouched coffee. The headlines still followed us like ghosts, the Whitmore downfall, from laughter to lesson, the bride who chose love over legacy. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt hollow. Daniel looked up from his screen. You're thinking too loud, he said gently. I tried to smile, but it came out thin. It's strange. I thought I'd feel lighter. But it's like something's missing. He closed his laptop. You're grieving. For what? For the illusion, he said. You lost a version of your family you hoped existed. I stared at the window. The skyline glowed faintly against the morning fog. I don't even know what I believe anymore. He stood and poured more coffee into my cup. Then don't decide yet. Let quiet do its work. But quiet had never been my strength. It left too much room for remembering. By noon, the messages started again, friends asking for interviews, journalists wanting exclusive perspectives. My name was trending next to words like bravery and scandal. I wanted to scream. There was nothing brave about watching your family crumble, even if they built their house on pride. Daniel turned off my phone. You don't owe anyone a performance. I just wish it didn't have to end this way. He leaned against the counter. You can't rewrite them, Evelyn. You can only rewrite you. The next few days blurred together. I walked through the city, aimlessly drifting in and out of shops, cafes, places where no one knew my name. Every now and then, someone would glance at me like they recognized me, then hesitate. I'd smile politely and walk faster. At night, Daniel worked late, his quiet presence both comforting and distant. He'd built his peace on patience. I was still learning mine through absence. One evening, I found an envelope slipped under our door. No return address, just my name. Inside was a folded letter written in my mother's careful looping handwriting. Dinner. Tomorrow night. Just us. I stared at it for a long time. The last time she'd invited me to dinner, it had ended with tears and silence that lasted months. But the words "just us" lingered. They felt different. The next night I went. She chose a small cafe downtown, the kind that played soft jazz and smelled like cinnamon and rain. She was already there, sitting by the window, a scarf around her neck, despite the mild weather. When she saw me, she smiled, tired, tentative. "You came. I wasn't sure I would." "Neither was I," she admitted. We sat in silence for a while, both of us stirring cups of tea we didn't need. Finally, she said, "Your father isn't doing well. He's quieter than I've ever seen him." "I didn't want him to break," I said softly. "I just wanted him to see me." "He does now," she whispered. "But it took losing everything." Her voice cracked. I looked up, and for the first time she didn't hide behind poise. The woman who'd built her life around control looked fragile, human. "I don't know how to fix this," she said. "All my life I thought being strong meant being right. And now I think it means saying you were wrong." The words hit harder than I expected. I reached across the table, hesitating before taking her hand. "You don't have to fix everything, Mom. You just have to stop pretending it's unbreakable." Her eyes shimmered with tears. "Your father misses you." "I miss him too," I said, "but I don't miss the version of him who thought love was conditional." She nodded slowly. "Maybe he's trying to learn otherwise." When I left, the air outside was cool, tinged with the smell of rain. I didn't cry. I just breathed slowly, deeply, for the first time in months. Back home, Daniel was sitting on the couch barefoot, a mug of tea beside him. "How was it?" Hard, I said. "But not hopeless." He smiled. "That's progress." We sat in silence for a while. The city lights flickered across his face, catching in his eyes. "You know," he said after a while, "forgiveness isn't about giving them peace. It's about giving it back to yourself." "I know," I said. "I just don't know how." He leaned closer. "You start by admitting that you don't have to know." That night, I dreamed of my childhood home. It wasn't the mansion I grew up in, it was smaller, warmer. My father wasn't behind his desk, and my mother wasn't arranging flowers for guests that never stayed. They were sitting at a table, laughing. I was there too, not as their daughter, but as someone who finally understood them. When I woke up, there was a text from my mother. "He wants to see you. Please come." Daniel was already awake, working on his laptop. "You should go," he said, without looking up. "Why does everyone keep saying that?" I asked. "Because you're not done yet," he replied. The drive to Charleston felt shorter this time. The roads that once led to fear now felt like a return to something unfinished. When I reached the house, I sat in the car for a long moment before going inside. My father was in the living room, thinner, his hair more gray than I remembered. He looked up from his chair, and for a second neither of us spoke. "You came," he said finally. "I did." He gestured to the seat across from him. "Your mother says you've been busy." "I've been rebuilding," he nodded. "I read about Daniel's company. Impressive." I smiled faintly. "He's more than impressive." "I know," he said. "That's what makes this harder." "Harder?" He looked away, eyes fixed on the fireplace. "To admit I was wrong." The words came out rough, heavy. "I never hated him, you know," he said after a moment. "I just couldn't see past what he wasn't. It's easy to mistake arrogance for authority when you've spent your life being obeyed." I leaned forward, my voice quiet. "You hurt him. You hurt me." He nodded. "I know, and now I live with it." We sat in silence, the fire crackling softly between us. Finally, I said, "I don't want revenge anymore. I want peace." His eyes met mine. "Then maybe you're stronger than I ever was." I stood. He didn't reach for me, but he didn't look away either. "You don't have to forgive me," he said quietly. "Just don't let me be the reason you stop loving." I swallowed hard. That's not how love works, Dad. Outside, the sky was streaked with gold as the sun began to set. My mother stood by the doorway watching. Did he listen? She asked. He heard me, I said. That's enough. Driving home, the road shimmered under the fading light. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was leaving something behind. I was carrying it differently. Daniel was waiting when I returned. He didn't ask what happened. He just took my hand and said, "You look lighter." I nodded. Maybe I finally stopped fighting ghosts. He smiled, pulling me close. Good, because we have living to do. As night fell over the city, I stood by the window watching the lights blur together. I thought of my father's trembling voice, my mother's tears, the long years I'd spent mistaking pride for strength. I used to think revenge was power, I whispered. Now I think forgiveness might be. Daniel kissed my temple. That's because real power doesn't need an audience. And in that quiet, I finally understood what peace felt like. It wasn't loud. It wasn't triumphant. It was simply the sound of breathing without anger. The invitation came in the simplest way, a text from my mother. Dinner. Friday. Just family. For a while, I stared at the screen, half expecting the old ache to rise again, the kind that made my chest tighten every time I thought about walking back into that house. But something in me had shifted since that last visit. I wasn't returning to seek approval anymore. I was returning to end the story properly. The evening was cool and quiet when I arrived in Charleston. The Whitmore estate looked smaller now, not because it had changed, but because I had. My mother greeted me at the door with a nervous smile, her perfume faint and familiar. "He's waiting in the dining room," she said. The room was different this time. No crystal chandeliers or gold centerpieces, no servants moving like ghosts in the background. Just a small table, 3 plates, and the soft hum of the fireplace. My father was already seated, wearing a simple gray sweater instead of a suit. The years had begun to show on him, the slight tremor in his hands, the lines deepening around his mouth. He looked up as I entered. "You came," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "You asked," I replied. We sat down. The air between us felt dense but not hostile, just heavy with all the things we'd left unsaid. My mother poured wine into 3 glasses, her movements careful as though one wrong gesture could shatter the fragile calm. For a few minutes no one spoke. The only sound was the faint clink of cutlery against porcelain. Then my father cleared his throat. "I owe you both an apology," he began. His gaze flicked between us. "Though I'm not sure where to start." "Start anywhere," I said softly. "The beginning's already gone." He nodded. "I was wrong. About Daniel. About you." His hands trembled slightly around the wine glass. I thought I was protecting this family, but I was just protecting my pride. I studied his face, searching for insincerity, but found none. "You didn't just hurt him," I said. "You made me feel like love had to pass an audit." He swallowed hard. "I know. I watched that video again, the one everyone shared. I saw my own face while I laughed. I looked like a man I didn't recognize." My mother reached across the table, touching his wrist. "We built our world on appearances," she said, "and it took losing everything to see how empty it was." He sighed, staring into his glass. "When I saw Daniel walk in that night, with those investors, the press, I realized something. I wasn't angry at him for being successful. I was angry because I hadn't seen it, because it proved how blind I'd become." Silence stretched. Then I said, "You mocked what you didn't understand. You called his work a game." He met my eyes, and he played it better than anyone I've ever met. A faint smile ghosted across his lips. "You know, I saw an interview he gave last week. The way he spoke about innovation, about purpose, I thought, that could have been me once before I traded curiosity for control." The fire crackled softly. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. "You always measured success by who bowed to you," I said. "Daniel measures it by who stands with him." He nodded slowly. "And that's why he's the better man." I hadn't expected those words. They landed like a sigh I didn't know I'd been holding. After a moment, my father pushed his plate aside. I never told you what happened after that night, he said. The board met without me. They voted to remove me from my position. They said I'd lost perspective. They were right. I'm sorry, I said quietly. He chuckled, though there was no humor in it. Don't be. For the first time in my life, I don't have to pretend to be right all the time. I looked at him, the man who once terrified me with silence, now sitting small beneath the weight of his own reflection. You could start again, I said. Not as the man you were, but as the one who's learning. He smiled faintly. Maybe I already have. Just then a knock came at the door. My mother stood frowning. Who could that be? When she opened it, Daniel stepped in. My heart lurched. He was holding a bottle of wine, the same vintage my father used to favor. I hope I'm not intruding, he said. Evelyn thought you might want company. My father rose slowly. For a long moment, the two men just looked at each other, the man who once laughed and the man who never had to raise his voice to win. Daniel broke the silence first. I didn't come here for an apology. I came to share a meal. My father extended his hand. Then let's start with that. The handshake was brief but heavy, like closing a chapter. We sat again, all four of us now, and the conversation began awkwardly but warmed with time. They spoke about Lumitech, about the state of the markets, about how the world was changing faster than anyone could control. My father listened more than he talked, his old dominance replaced by something gentler curiosity. At one point, he looked at Daniel and said, "Why didn't you ever tell us who you really were?" Daniel smiled. "Because I wanted you to know the man before the title. Money doesn't change character, it just reveals it." My father nodded, eyes distant. I wish I'd learned that sooner. The rest of the dinner passed in an unexpected peace. We laughed a little. We argued softly about trivial things. When the plates were cleared and the candles burned low, my father poured the last of the wine. "To truth," he said quietly. I raised my glass. "To peace." Daniel added, "To grace, the kind that doesn't humiliate, to feel powerful." We clinked glasses, the sound small but sacred. When it was time to leave, I lingered by the door. My father followed me, stopping just before I stepped outside. "Evelyn," he said, "I don't deserve forgiveness. But I'm asking anyway." I turned. "You already have it," I said, "because I needed to let it go." He smiled, real tired, human. "You remind me of your mother when she was brave," he said. "You just never stopped being it." For the first time in my life, he pulled me into an embrace. His arms were trembling and so were mine. "You were never my failure," he whispered. I pulled back, tears stinging my eyes. "You were never my enemy," I said. Outside, the air was cool and clean, carrying the faint smell of rain. Daniel waited by the car. When I reached him, he took my hand. "How did it go?" he asked. "Better than I expected. Worse than I imagined," I said. He smiled. "That sounds like healing." As we drove away, I glanced through the window one last time. The house glowed softly in the dark, no longer a fortress, just a home learning how to breathe again. Daniel squeezed my hand. "You okay?" I nodded. "I think I finally am." The road ahead stretched long and quiet. For the first time, there was no anger left in me, only a strange, steady calm. "I used to think forgiveness was surrender," I said, my voice low. "But maybe it's just the first real victory." Daniel smiled. "You've always been better at winning quietly." We drove into the night, the headlights cutting through the dark like truth, finally finding its way home. The morning after the dinner, sunlight spilled across the kitchen table, painting the marble in gold. For once, it didn't feel harsh, it felt earned. Daniel was reading the paper, his hair still tousled from sleep, a mug of coffee in his hand. When he noticed me, he smiled in that quiet way he always did, as if peace didn't have to be announced. "They issued a statement," he said, sliding the paper toward me. "Your parents." I looked down. On the front page was the headline, "Whitmore family expresses regret over public incident, announces withdrawal from corporate leadership." Below it, a photo of my parents' older, softer human. The words beneath read, "We learned that legacy means nothing without love, and that true wealth is not what's inherited, but what's earned in forgiveness. I traced the sentence with my finger. She wrote that I murmured. Daniel looked up. Your mother, she always used love like armor. Maybe now she's learning to use it as language. He smiled. Sounds like the whole family's rebranding. I laughed quietly, the sound surprising me. Maybe it's time. The phone buzzed again, a message from Forbes. We'd love to feature you and Daniel in an upcoming interview about modern legacy. Your story has changed how people see success. I stared at the screen for a moment. Do we say yes? Daniel shrugged. If we do, let's make it mean something. The interview took place 2 days later at a small studio overlooking the harbor. The air smelled of sea salt and fresh coffee, and the walls were lined with framed covers of visionaries and innovators. The journalist, a kind woman named Melissa, greeted us warmly and began recording. Evelyn, your story has captivated people, she said. You defied expectations, married for love, and stood by a man everyone underestimated. What does success mean to you now? I glanced at Daniel before answering. Success used to mean being noticed. Now it means being useful. It's about creating something that outlives the applause. Melissa nodded. And for you, Daniel? You've built one of the fastest-growing tech firms in the country, but your public debut wasn't exactly planned. Daniel chuckled. No, it wasn't. But sometimes life chooses your launch date for you. I used to think success was freedom from judgment. Now I think it's the courage to stand in it and still be kind. Melissa leaned forward. There's a quote from you circulating online. Revenge is loud. Integrity whispers. Is that how you live? Daniel smiled slightly. That's how I survive. When the interview ended, Melissa turned off the recorder and said, You know you two make people believe that wealth can still have a conscience. On the drive home, the city moved lazily under the afternoon sunday. Daniel reached over, resting his hand on my knee. You did good, he said. So did you, I replied. We didn't talk much after that. Words felt unnecessary. The kind of quiet between us wasn't empty anymore. It was the sound of peace settling in. Later that evening, as we sat on the balcony, Daniel pulled out his laptop. I've been thinking about something, he said. Lumitech's expansion. What if we use part of our profits to fund new entrepreneurs, especially women starting out in tech? I turned to him. A mentorship program. Not just mentorship, he said. Ownership, equity, real opportunity. The kind no one gave me. I smiled. Then let's do it. Let's build the kind of ladder we never had. He nodded. And I want you to lead it. Me? Yes, you. You understand legacy better than anyone. You know how it feels to rebuild a name. I stared at him, speechless for a moment. You think I can do this? He grinned. I don't think. I know. The following weeks moved fast. Lumitech's Empower initiative launched quietly but spread quickly. Investors loved it. Media outlets praised it. More importantly, young women began to write to us letters filled with dreams, ideas, and gratitude. One message read, You made me believe ambition isn't arrogance, it's hope with a plan. Reading those words, something inside me shifted. For the first time, my family name didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a bridge. Then one afternoon, a package arrived from Charleston. Inside was my father's old fountain pen, the same one he'd used to sign every deal of his career. There was a note attached, written in his familiar handwriting. For your next signature, make it count. I held the pen for a long time. It wasn't an apology this time. It was a passing of truth, not power. That evening at Lumitech's conference hall, I stood before a room of journalists, investors, and employees. Daniel watched from the front row, his eyes steady on me. I wasn't nervous. I was ready. When I was young, I was taught that wealth was something you inherited, that it came from names and legacies written in stone. But what I've learned is that real wealth can't be handed down. It's built piece by piece through humility and purpose. You can inherit fear. You can inherit pride, but you can also choose to inherit courage. The room was silent, every face turned toward me. I once believed revenge would fix everything. I continued. It didn't. What fixed it was building something bigger than the pain that started it. This, I gestured around, is what that looks like. Applause rose slowly, at first, then swelled until it filled the room. Daniel stood clapping the loudest. Afterward, as the crowd dispersed, I stepped outside. The evening sky was streaked with pink and gold. My phone buzzed again, a text from my mother. "We watched your speech," he cried. "We're proud of you." I didn't reply right away. I just looked out over the city and whispered, "I think I'm proud of me too." That night, Daniel poured 2 glasses of wine. We sat on the balcony again, the city lights flickering like a constellation at our feet. "You've changed everything," he said softly. "No," I replied. "We did," he smiled. "Your father gave you his pen." "What are you going to do with it?" I looked at it, lying on the table beside us, gleaming faintly under the light. "Keep writing," I said, but this time in my own ink. We clinked glasses. Below us, the world moved on, unaware of the small revolution happening on that balcony. Later, as I got ready for bed, I stood by the mirror and caught my reflection. For years, I'd measured my worth by who approved of me. Now the woman staring back didn't need anyone's permission. Real wealth, I realized, wasn't measured in millions or headlines. It was in moments like this, quiet, steady, unshakable. I looked over at Daniel, already half asleep, and smiled. "We did it," I whispered. He murmured something I barely caught. "It sounded like you were always going to." I slipped into bed beside him, feeling the weight of everything and nothing all at once. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new noise, new expectations. But for now there was peace, simple, undemanding, complete. And as I closed my eyes, one final thought settled over me like a lullaby. Legacy isn't what you leave behind, it's what you build while you're still here. The city felt different that morning, softer somehow. Spring sunlight filtered through the glass towers, glinting off the Hudson like it was newly polished. I walked with my coffee in hand, the same cafe Daniel and I had stumbled into years ago when we couldn't afford anything but dreams. The barista, older now, smiled as soon as he saw me. "You two still together?" he asked, wiping the counter with a rag that smelled faintly of cinnamon. "Still," I said, smiling. "Somehow." He laughed. "I knew it. You both looked like you believed in something." I handed him a tip that made him blink, then said softly, "We still do." The bell jingled as I left. The world outside felt clean, like life had finally stopped testing me and started trusting me. At the foundation office, the walls buzzed with quiet energy. Young women in bright blazers and messy buns hurried between meetings, their laughter cutting through the usual hum of business. On one wall hung a framed motto, "Empower, don't just employ." A girl barely 20 ran up to me, eyes wide with pride. "Miss Whitmore, I just got funding for my app idea. It's going to help women track small business credit safely. You said once that power isn't about money, it's about what you build, and now I get it." I felt something warm unfold in my chest. "That's the whole point," I said. "Build something worth passing on." She grinned and darted away. I walked past the glass doors to find Daniel speaking with a group of interns, sleeves rolled up, gesturing animatedly as he explained a model on the board. His hair was longer now, streaked with the faintest gray. When he looked up and saw me, his smile still reached his eyes. "You're early," he said, coming over. "Habit," I replied. "I like seeing the chaos before the order." He brushed a strand of hair behind my ear. "You built the kind of order that still feels human." "I built what I needed," I said softly. That afternoon my phone buzzed. It was my mother. The message was short. "He's gone." Peacefully. For a moment the world narrowed to the quiet between breaths. The funeral was simple. No cameras, no chandeliers, just the sound of waves and the rustle of magnolia trees in the wind. My mother held my hand so tightly that neither of us could tell who was comforting whom. "He changed, Evelyn," she whispered. "He really did." "I know," I said. "So did I." After everyone left, she handed me a small wooden box. Inside were my father's journals, handwritten, dated from the years after the fall. The first page read, "She taught me that strength isn't silence, it's love that forgives even when it remembers." I closed my eyes. For the first time, I cried without bitterness. They were not tears of anger or victory, but of understanding. That night back in the city, I sat on the balcony with Daniel, the skyline shimmering like a heartbeat. I held the journal on my lap, tracing the inked letters with my fingertips. "You okay?" he asked. "I think so," I said. He finally found peace. Maybe now I can too. Daniel poured us both a glass of wine. "He left you something, didn't he?" "His words," I said. "And maybe a little wisdom I wasn't ready for." He leaned back, watching the stars begin to appear. "What are you going to do with it?" "Keep writing," I said. But this time, in my own ink. Months passed quietly. The foundation grew. The name Whitmore stopped appearing in headlines about scandal and started appearing in stories about rebuilding. I spoke at schools, mentorship events, and conferences, but the moment that stayed with me most came one spring morning when Columbia University invited me to deliver the commencement address. The auditorium was full sunlight, pouring through high windows, illuminating hundreds of young faces full of hope. "When your story begins with laughter," I told them, "don't rush to erase it. Sometimes humiliation is the first language of transformation." A ripple of recognition moved through the room. "I once believed that revenge would heal me," I continued. "That showing the world my worth would make the pain go away. But it didn't. What healed me was building something larger than my anger, something that could outlast it." I paused, meeting the eyes of a young woman in the front row who looked just like I had years ago, afraid, unproven, defiant. "Revenge may light a spark," I said. "But forgiveness builds the fire that keeps you warm." The applause that followed was soft at first, then steady, then thunderous. But I didn't hear it for me. I heard it for every woman who had been silenced, laughed at, or dismissed, and who refused to stay that way. After the ceremony, a student approached me shyly. "Miss Whitmore," she said, "do you forgive them, the ones who hurt you?" I smiled. "Every day," I said. "And every day I forgive myself a little more too." That night, Daniel and I sat by the window again, watching the city shimmer under the spring rain. "You've changed everything," he said quietly. "No," I said. "We did." He took my hand, thumb brushing the edge of my wrist. "Do you ever miss the chaos?" I thought about it. "No. But I thank it for bringing me here." We sat in silence for a while, the rain a soft percussion against the glass. The city pulsed below, alive and indifferent, just as it always had been. "The world doesn't owe us peace," I said. "But we owe it to ourselves to stop living like we have to earn it." Daniel kissed my temple. "So what's next?" "Whatever keeps the light honest," I whispered. He smiled. "Then that's what we'll do." The next morning, I walked along the river, the air smelling faintly of salt and possibility. Seagulls wheeled overhead, and the city skyline mirrored perfectly on the still water. I thought about everything: the humiliation, the redemption, the strange symmetry of karma and grace, and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Stillness. It wasn't the absence of noise, it was the presence of understanding. I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened the Foundation's social page. Messages from women all over the world flooded in stories of survival, growth, small victories. Each one felt like a continuation of mine. I began typing a post. "If you've ever been underestimated, remember this silence isn't weakness. It's just the space before your power begins." Then I hit publish and smiled. The sun broke through the clouds, light dancing across the river. Somewhere behind me, a church bell rang. And for the first time I realized the story wasn't ending, it was simply evolving. Maybe that's the real secret to closure. It isn't when the pain disappears, it's when it finally makes sense. What about you? Have you ever had to prove your worth to someone who refused to see it? Tell me your story. Maybe it's time the world heard your truth too. If this story spoke to you, stay a while. There are more voices like ours, stories of quiet strength of revenge that became rebirth. Like, comment, and subscribe. Because every story deserves its light, and every woman deserves to see how bright hers can still shine.